Okay, well, welcome to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a pretty question-heavy chapter, so make sure when we go through questions, you are talking to the person next to you and you're really trying to, talk about what it is to talk about. Chapter 2 is Myrtle. I love Myrtle. She's one of my favorite characters, so I hope you like Myrtle as well. Let's kind of get started. What I want you to think about when we're talking about chapter 2 is like, if the wealthy take what they want without concern for others, what are the consequences? Like, who pays for it? What happens to the ones that aren't privileged, like Myrtle? Who gets hurt in the relationship? Is it Tom or Myrtle? I think without even reading the chapter, you know it's going to be Myrtle that gets hurt. And we really see it in a very physical way in this chapter, how Myrtle gets hurt, but there's more figuratively that we need to talk about as well. Okay, Myrtle lives in the Valley of Ashes, and the Valley of Ashes is like right sort of between the eggs and New York City. You have to pass through the Valley of Ashes. It's also a symbol. Right? Anything called the Valley of Ashes has to be a symbol. So some pictures from the movie. It did really exist in real life, like I just learned this not that long ago, but Flushing's, New York was the Valley of Ashes at one point, like way long ago. So like Flushing's, New York now is where the tennis New York Open or the U.S. Open is held. And anyway, it was called the Valley of Ashes at one point, and it was where like industries would like take these ashes that they would dump these and they burn them in the Valley of Ashes and create these like big heaps of ashes, like a dumping ground, they wouldn't take ashes, they'd take their garbage and they would dump it there, and then it would they'd set it to fire, and there would be like men who worked out there and sort of moved the ashes around. That's a great job. So just some sort of pictures. And in the Valley of Ashes, there's this billboard. In the 20s, billboards were just becoming popular. Cars, more people had cars in the 20s than ever before. And so there was advertising on the road, and there was a sort of left billboard in the Valley of Ashes for this Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. And like, all that's left on the billboard are like his eyes. So it's like this giant pair of eyes that's sort of watching over the Valley of Ashes, and lots of scholars sort of believe that they represent to some extent the eyes of God. So he's a symbol as well when we talk about symbols that way. So again, here's a map. There's the Valley of Ashes. You can see it, right here. Wilson's garage is right there. If you kept sort of going on, like here's where the eggs would go. And then if you kept going this way, you would go to New York. So it's like between the eggs and New York. And you have to to get from one side to the other side, you have to cross this little stream right here. And so there's a train track that goes here, and then there's a road. And if there's a ship coming, like a barge, right, what has to happen is like the bridge has to open up, and then the ship gets to go through, and then the bridge closes. And so on this day that Nick and Tom are supposed to be going to lunch together in the city, they're driving along and they get stopped because the bridge has to open and let this barge through. And that's what gives Tom this great idea to go over to Wilson's garage and to check out Myrtle. I love the descriptions in this novel, and this one that's described as a certain desolate area of land, this Valley of Ashes. It's where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke. Now remember our sentence patterns, that's a 4, right? The ends. Of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Those are great descriptions. Okay. And then we have Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. And he's above the gray land, and the spasms of bleak dust you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. His eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under the sun in rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. So the grounds themselves are being described as a dumping ground, but we have to translate that, or transfer it, I should say, over to the people that live there, like over to Myrtle. And here's Myrtle's husband, George Wilson. He was a blonde, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. And do you remember we talked about in chapter 1 that these like short descriptions that are just packed with words, these short sentences that are just packed with words, that we're looking for words that kind of mean the same thing, but they're different words. They're synonyms to each other. And we can kind of see that here to some extent. He's blonde, spiritless, and faintly handsome, anemic. They all in some way mean he's washed out to some extent, like he is almost transparent, like there isn't much to him. And then Tom, Nick asks, does Wilson know? And Tom says, Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. That sort of plays on this sort of like, it's almost like he's faded to some degree, like he's not really there. So Wilson went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement colors of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved close to Tom. I want you to reread that to yourself, and I want you to look for the color. And we just talked about that idea that there's a word that might be repeated in different ways, different synonyms. Can you find the color that's present in this paragraph? Tell your deskmate what color and all the words that mean that color. I hope you're finding words like cement, white ashen, pale, dust even. Is there a word that's repeated? Can you find the word that's there twice? I hope you're able to see that's veiled. So think about what this description is trying to say about Wilson. What is Fitzgerald trying to say about Wilson? And think about what a veil is. What does a veil do? I always often think about a veil, that a bride wears a veil, or like a lady who goes to a funeral wears a veil. It's like over her face. So imagine what it would be like to see the world through a veil. What is Fitzgerald trying to say about Wilson through this description? Talk to each other for a moment. And take a look and ask yourselves, talk with your deskmate, and how are Tom and Wilson different from each other? Here they are. This is a great image of them standing face to face, looking straight in the eye. How are they different? And then we get Myrtle. And I just love the descriptions in this book. Myrtle's a thickish figure of a woman. I love that. She's a thickish figure of a woman. Blocked the light from office door. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediate perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. What an amazing description. Now, she's not beautiful, right? Her face contained no gleam of beauty. She is a little heavy set. She's thick. She's faintly stout, right? But, so what is it? It's certainly not her beauty that Tom is after. What adjectives are used that show why Tom likes Myrtle? Tell your deskmate what you think right now. I hope you're pointing out things like sensuously and vitality. What does vitality mean, right? It means life, right? That she has some sort of life about her. I love that it's like her nerves. I'm going to go back to that slide for a moment. That her nerves are continually smoldering. And when you think about what Tom doesn't have, like he's desperate for some. He's like desperate for some drama, for some like life. And that's exactly what she has. She has this like life about her, as if her body itself is like on fire. So that has to be attractive to him. Like, he has beauty. He has Daisy. She's the most beautiful, classically beautiful woman, that anybody has ever seen. She's well bred. She's intelligent. She's all of these things. And so he's looking for kind of the exact opposite of that. Like, here's this woman who, is like sexy and alive. And I think that's kind of the big adjective there. So the interesting part, though, about Myrtle, Mrs. Wilson, that says her last name's Wilson there, is that when she gets into Tom's world, she starts changing a bit. And this is a great sort of quote. It says, Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before, so when she gets to the apartment, she changes her clothes. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted to impressive hauteur. So take a moment and tell each other who knows what this word means. Okay. And then answer this question. How does Myrtle change when she enters Tom's world? What changes about her? Talk to each other for a moment, see if you can figure it out. She, what's the one thing that Tom loved about her, that like sense of life, leaves her, and then she becomes sort of snobby. So she's sort of adapting Tom's characteristics, which is an interesting thing that happens. So they have this party, right? Everybody gets drunk at this party. And Mrs. McKee and Mr. McKee, they're neighbors. Tom has rented this apartment in the city so he can take Myrtle someplace because, how is he going to be alone with her? He's an adult, rich adult at that. So he gets this apartment that he pays for so he can go someplace with her. And Mr. and Mrs. McKee come over sometimes and party with them. Mrs. McKee says, I like your dress, remarked Mrs. McKee. I think it's adorable. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. It's just a crazy old thing. I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like. And that's sort of the interaction between them. And what I want you to think about is what evidence is present here that shows Myrtle thinks of herself as a higher class than she really is. Because remember, she comes from the Valley of Ashes. So find the evidence. Tell your desk mate, what is it? Hope you're pointing things out, like she's raising her eyebrow in disdain. Now she does that old woman thing, like, when back in like old movies when, women would go on dates and then they buy these like new dresses and then the guy would like compliment her and she didn't want to seem like she was trying very hard, so she would say something like, oh, I just threw this on, like this old thing. And that's what you can see that Myrtle is doing here, when we all know that this is probably the fanciest dress she's ever owned, and she's like just sort of passing it off as like something she has all the time. And then we sort of get the reason or how Tom and Myrtle met. And Myrtle says, Tom had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever. She says, well, I married George because I thought he was a gentleman. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it. What is Myrtle most concerned about in her husband when we sort of contrast these two? Talk to your desk mate and see if you can figure it out. Ooh, let's go back to that because I'm not done with that. On surface level, these two descriptions make Myrtle seem pretty shallow because we are like, oh, well, she cares about what he looks like. Well, she likes Tom because he's in this fancy suit and she hates George because he doesn't own one. But I want you to like think deeper than that and think about it from Myrtle. We often like take it for granted that we can get married for love. but that wasn't always true in history, and sometimes it's not always true in present day. Like, you're probably pretty lucky because you'll get to pick whoever you want to marry, and it will most likely be for love. But there's certainly a time in our history where that wasn't always the case, where people married to think about the future. Like, if they married this person, it will give them a better life than they came from. And then if they have children with that person, then that their children will have a better life. And like, it's one of the ways that, generations helped move other generations forward, is that marriages weren't always about love. And so, and they happen very quickly. That's always something that surprises me about old people and how they got married. Like, we met and then 3 months later we got married. When I think about like my grandparents, they got married very quickly. And so Myrtle, she marries this man, and he has this suit, or at least she thinks he has this suit. And this suit represents a type of life. Like, what type of person has to own a suit? I mean, it should indicate that he is a businessman, that he has like a stable job, and he has some income coming in. And then she finds out after she committed to him, she can't get a divorce. Where is she going to go? She's poor. After she made this choice, that he didn't even own the suit, that he's I think she feels misled, that she was worth more, that she could have gotten a better life. And now she's stuck with George, who's a mechanic. Not that there's anything wrong with the mechanic, but she's stuck in the Valley of Ashes with a man who can barely make a living, and notice they don't have children, who can not really support a future that she sort of wanted. And I think she does feel betrayed by him. And so when she focuses on their suits, it's not because she's shallow. It's because for Myrtle, they represent a lifestyle. And I think she feels cheated out of what she believes or deserves she was supposed to have. When you think about Myrtle's power, we haven't talked about that, but that's her vitality, right? Everybody's got power. Okay, let's keep going. And, as the time goes on, they get more and more drunk, and we see Myrtle getting more and more confident, and she says to Mrs. McKee, she says, "My dear, I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow." And she even, gets even more sort of powerful and arrogant, and she says, "I told that boy about the ice." Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. "These people, you have to keep after them all the time." The party just sort of gets out of control. And there's things that Myrtle says here where you can see that she feels like she's better than the people around her. Can you pick out some of the evidence from these two statements and tell your desk mate? Where she says she's going to raise her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. She's going to get rid of her dress. Like, she's got to get a new one. It's sort of adding up, and like Myrtle is like slowly getting more and more confident. So talk to each other for a moment about this question. What effect does Tom and Tom's lifestyle have on Myrtle? And then, we kind of get the big scene. And this is such the language in here and the way Fitzgerald places the characters is so specific. It says, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face. So here Mrs. Wilson has stood up to him as if she is his equal. Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. And so that, I guess I was predicting that question coming there. Like, how does Myrtle show she's equal? She's right there. She's standing face to face with him. She's defying Tom, who says, don't do it. And she's like, I do, she says. Yeah, let me go for it. She says, Daisy, Daisy, Daisy. I'll say it whatever I want to. Daisy, Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. And here she does. She steps up to him. She says, "I'm is equal to you," and he like physically and figuratively like puts her back in her place. And remember, this is like a sort of a character, description of Tom. Tom is challenged in this one moment. He's challenged by Myrtle, his mistress, and he decisively takes care of it. That should give you some indication about if he were to be challenged again, what he would do. Anyway, how does Tom show her that she is not equal? Well, he breaks her nose, right? And ultimately, it's a sign to Myrtle that a mistress can never be more than the mistress. That's like a hard lesson for Myrtle. She'll never be the wife. And she just has to sort of play that role no matter what. And that's hard. So we come back to this sort of idea, right? Like who gets hurt, and we knew it before we read it, but we really see it there. And I think Myrtle comes off as sort of this crass character who just like wants money. She's a gold digger. She's just like married. She wants to be a Tom just for his money. But I'm just gonna like throw it out there that I don't think any of these characters are doing anything worse or better than Myrtle is. I don't think she's any worse than any other character. And I think that at least her plight, is true. Daisy's is to some extent as well. Tom's cheating on her and she feels like she's kind of getting robbed of this sort of marriage. And so is Myrtle. So don't dismiss Myrtle of just being like this money hungry person. She, there's more to her than that. Okay. So there's this other kind of crazy storyline. Like what happened in the ... right? It says then, so they're super drunk. Nick even says like this is the second time in his life that he's ever been drunk or something like that. So he decides to leave and Mr. McKee follows him. And it says then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door, taking my hat from the chandelier. I followed. So Mr. McKee leaves and Nick follows him. And then they go down the elevator. And there's this ... afterwards, and it says, I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. Then there's a time gap, like another time gap. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station. So what happens in these time gaps that that Nick apparently doesn't remember? If you are at a man's apartment in his bedroom and he's naked in bed, whatever you think happened probably did happen. Most scholars believe that they probably did sleep together. The 20s was a decade of like sexual awakening. It was the first decade where a woman could go out and buy birth control, where it was like you could go down to the store and get it. So there was like a sexual like liberation for women. Like women could have boyfriends, they could sleep with men and not have to get pregnant and worry about getting pregnant, not have like the physical proof to show that what you did. And so there was like a lot of sexual freedom that way for women, but the men also were experimenting as well. And it wouldn't have been uncommon for some men to have experimented with other men at parties, except the difference is in the 20s you'd never really talk about it. So many scholars believe that Fitzgerald sort of doesn't say it out loud because in the 20s you wouldn't have said it out loud, but it would have happened. So keep that in mind. Okay, so other storylines, we hear a little bit about Gatsby, but we don't meet him yet. We actually don't meet him until the next chapter. But, what is really the one thing we know for sure about Gatsby? Out of everything that we hear, what's the truth? You know, in chapter 1, we know that he was mentioned at Jordan's party. He was seen looking at a green light. And then, you know, we have all these sort of rumors about him. It says I was down there at a party at a man named Gatsby's. They say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all the money comes from. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. So we have like all of these rumors about him, but we don't really know anything for sure. Now, why do you think Fitzgerald holds off introducing Gatsby? Why give you all these rumors? What's it supposed to be doing for you or as the reader? You know, remember when we think about rhetoric in argument, we're asking the same type of questions, like, right, what does this logic, what does this credibility, what does this emotional appeal do to the reader? How does it make the reader feel about the argument being presented? In a book of literature, we're doing the same thing. Like, the choices that the author makes. Fitzgerald is waiting 2 full chapters. The 3rd chapter is when you finally get to meet Gatsby, and you don't really get to meet him until the end of the chapter anyway. You're just like at his party. Why would Fitzgerald make this choice? What does he want you, the reader, to believe about Gatsby? Talk for a moment and see what you can come up with. Okay, that's it. That's chapter 2, a nice, short, sweet one. It's a great party there at Myrtle's. Your job is to read chapter 3 and finally get to meet Gatsby. Yes! And really pay attention to the language that's used to describe Gatsby. We know now that Fitzgerald, you know, is being very specific about descriptions and the way he describes people and the way it really tells a lot about their character, right? We talk about characterization. Appearance is like kind of a big one. You know, not to mention what other people have to say also is big for Gatsby. Like, it's really building his character, that characterization. So think about that. When we think about characterization for Nick, it's about his actions, right? Because it's his physicality that he uses to control people. He literally hit Myrtle to put her back in her place. And when you think about Daisy, her characterization comes down to her speech, right? Her voice and what that sort of is able to do for her. So we're looking at all of those different elements of characterization and how Fitzgerald is using them to help you understand who these people are. Okay, happy reading. Ooh, okay.